Welcome to week 2, Action Researchers. This week we're going to talk a little bit about some of the readings that you completed in week 1 with Mertler Chapter 1 and Chapter 2. We're also going to reinforce some of the concepts of what classroom-based action research looks like so that we start to hone in on possible research topics for your projects. And we're also going to get into the beginning stages of research this week with the abstract assignment that's due. So let's go ahead and talk through just some key pieces before I turn you loose into the work for the week. So our week 2 agenda, we're going to review some of the key points from week 1 and week 2 so I can maybe draw out some things that are important that you need to focus on this week when you read ahead into Mertler Chapter 3 as one of your assignments. We're going to unpack a little bit more the definitions and processes of action research. Mertler gives you some great examples in Chapter 1 and Chapter 2 that you would have just read here in week 1. So really we're firming up our understanding of action research at the classroom level and what that can look like as you continue to take steps forward in identifying potential research questions and the problem statement that really captures what it is you want to try and solve in improving instruction and student learning in your classroom. So that's our plan for this week where we're really going to focus. Just as a reminder, we talked a little bit last week about action research, and we talked about the difference between classroom-based action research and traditional research. So we are developing a process. We're going to follow a process where you as the participant examine your own educational practice. We're going to take a systematic way of approaching that. So there are steps that we are going to concretely go through as we develop your research project and implement it. And we will use the techniques of research, including, researching the existing literature to find out what works and what research is there to support a change that you want to make. We'll look at existing techniques of developing a methodology for how you're going to implement your change and then collect your data. We're also going to develop a data analysis plan for how you're going to analyze the data and know whether or not you've made an impact or what impact the change has made on student learning. So that's kind of the key techniques of research that we'll be following in our very short time in the remaining time in the class. Action research is based on the following assumptions. It's based on the assumption that teachers and principals work best on problems they have identified for themselves. And if you think about the traditional research last week, we talked about that that's really somebody else coming in and looking at a problem. This we're close to. So we understand what the problem is we want to solve. We go and do the legwork on the research. We implement the change and we look at the data to know whether or not we are really making a difference rather than relying on an outside source to come in and tell us what difference we're making. That's the fundamental difference. Teachers and principals become more effective when encouraged to examine and assess their own work. Action research has been in existence for a very long time, much longer than MTSS or the response to intervention that many of our schools are engaged in that we know is really problem solving around the needs of kids. And if you've been through that process or you have a robust process in place for your school, you understand that essentially that is action research. There's a lot of data to be collected to know whether or not the intervention plans that we're implementing for kids are working. And if the data shows they're not, then we make a change. Essentially, that's action research. It's a collaborative team. So this is just another iteration of that, and I think that's really where that was born out of, was action research. Teachers and principals need time and space away from their daily routine. So I know that this is a trying time of year, a trying year, as many of us are experiencing teaching and learning all over again in the first year with the situation that we have with COVID. So but we're going to take the time in this class to make sure that we have some space to think about it. So everything you do is going to have meaning for your class that you are working with in your own professional setting. Teachers and principals can provide help and support and encouragement by working collaboratively. I stressed last week, don't do this in isolation, rely on your teams, talk through what you're doing for your class with the teams, reach out to others in the class, reach out to me, but don't let this be a project done in isolation. Find your collaborative network. Action researcher is not the usual things that we do when we think about our teaching. We don't typically say, I really have a problem here. I got to think about how I want to solve it, and I'm going to go ahead and develop a research project around it, and I'm going to test my theory, and I'm going to look at the data, and then I'm going to report it out to others. That's not our typical process, so this is a little different and a little bit more formal for this class. It's not only problem solving, it's not research on other people. As I said, it's about us, and it's not the scientific method applied to teaching. That would focus more on a traditional research course. As researchers, we in the classroom are developing research questions based on our own curiosity about teaching and learning. We're examining our own underlying assumptions, and sometimes that's my role as I call myself our lead learner or facilitator, is to kind of tease out why you think something may happen or be happening the way it is in a classroom, particularly with student behaviors. I find a lot of times we make assumptions on a situation, and oftentimes we haven't stopped to listen or look or find out more about a learner to determine what the function of a behavior truly might be. So that's kind of where I see my role as challenging some of your assumptions as you work toward problem solving on a topic you want to work on. We are collecting data systematically, and we'll talk through that as we get into weeks 3 and 4 of the course. And a key thing I'll have you think about here is we're collecting data from and with your students. I will encourage you at times to have your students be part of your data collection and be transparent with them. Let them know that you're taking a class. One of my teachers in my own district took my class about 4 years ago, and we were just talking last week about how she still, ever since that semester, tells her middle schoolers that she's doing research and it's for her college class and they have to help her on it. And she's like, I never knew how high they rise when they think they're really helping me out with something. So even though she's graduated and finished her degree through Baker, she still uses the Action Research Edge because it did make a difference for her kids to know that there was a different level of heightened importance to their work at that point in time. So their relevance does make rigor possible. Share and discuss data and research methodology with fellow teacher researchers. A requirement of this class is that you do share your research with other people, and that could be your teaching team, it could be your administrator, but don't just keep it to yourself what you're doing, because you are working to make an impact on kids and others need to know about it. We are going to be analyzing and interpreting data with the support of each other and our colleagues back in our schools. We're going to be writing about it, sharing findings. We've talked about a lot of this last week and then in the previous slides, so I'll keep moving on. Let's briefly review some of the additional pieces just to kind of support what Mertler talked about in chapter 1 and 2, and there's a few other researchers that I've used in the class that I just want to touch on for additional background information. So Mertler, chapter 1 was an introduction to action research, and he did talk a lot about the collaborative role of action research. And then in chapter 2, he talked about the action research process, and he kind of chunks things down into different stages. And there's some different ways to look at that from other researchers. So I just want to give you a kind of a quick research walk here for a second. So AR processes. Schmuck was a previous author in the research realm that we used to use for the course. And he talked about 3 different phases of continuous improvement. And this may be familiar because we talk a lot about school improvement, and it's school improvement and our processes that we have. If you're on the Kansas side and you're going through KISA, and there were different accreditation models before that, but it's always about figuring out what the problem is that we need to solve, working through that problem solving piece, implementing change, and then reviewing the data and engaging in a reflective practice. So there's really kind of 3 faces to that triangle that we continuously cycle through when we're looking at school-wide improvement, and that can translate down to the classroom level as well. Sager was another action research author that's well respected, and he talked about action research entry points. And there's a 5-step problem solving process where you formulate your problem, and that's much where we're at right now, is formulating what problem it is that we want to solve. We get into some data collection, data analysis, we report the results, and then we do further action planning. So it does become somewhat of a cycle. So at the end of your project, when you write up your results and you state your conclusions based on the data you saw, then the next stage of action research is to go right back into, what are you going to do with that data? Are you going to implement long-term change? Did it not work as well as you wanted it to, whatever action you took for that research? And how do you tweak it, and how do you don't give up? If you had a problem that you needed to focus on, you don't give up on the problem. You use what you did, and everything's always propelling you forward. So you go back into another cycle of action planning, according to Sager. This seems so simple or I use the very official ODA piece to this, but really if you think about it, what I want you to take away from this, and this is Lewin's work, and Mertler references Lewin in the first 2 chapters, but this was back from the 1940s that this was something that was introduced into research for educators. But force field analysis, and what I think is important is you start to identify your problem. I want you to think about last week when you did the right question activity where I told you to set a timer for 5 minutes and write every question you could write about your teaching and learning practice, about your classroom. And then I asked you before you posted those to think about what problems are solvable. Because we all have in our situation, we have facilitating forces, we have forces that are pushing us forward. So those are helpful, and maybe that's a supportive administrator. Maybe it's new resources that are coming in to maybe our basal reader at the elementary didn't have a strong phonemic component. So we're getting additional resources. Those would be facilitating forces that are taking us to the desirable state. We're solving a problem and we have some heft to go along with getting us there. Restraining forces are things that hold us back, that keep us from moving forward, right? So restraining forces, here's an example I'm going to lay out for you in terms of a problem that I would not encourage anyone to identify for their research. Homework completion. Every semester, at least one person, if not several, will identify in their list of questions, how do I get my students to complete their homework? Well, you have restraining forces on that. You can have the best descriptor, you can try and motivate all you want, but restraining forces are beyond your control. Sometimes it's home life for students. Sometimes it is a lack of parental support. Maybe they are working to try and support their family at the high school level. You've got teenagers that are working jobs and they just can't get to everything in their life. So there are restraining forces that prevent you from tackling that problem. So at that point, when you start to do some force field analysis around your problem you want to identify, I encourage you to think about what are the facilitating forces that will help support you in doing the action research. What are some of the restraining forces? Time might be a restraining force. So we have 7 weeks in the class, really 6 weeks, 5.5 weeks at the point that you're probably watching this video. So a restraining force might be time. So think about your problem. Will you have enough time to actually implement a change, which you should be targeting your change implementation by about week 4, week 5, and then collecting data in week 5, 6, and then turning in your project week 7. So really you want about 2 weeks of data collection. So an example that I saw for a student that was brainstorming is, how will departmentalization in content support learners? You probably won't have enough time to study that in a 7-week course for action research, but that might be a good problem for long term. So think about those restraining forces because that will help you get a meaningful project together for this class. Schmuck and Runkle, problem-solving steps, and this kind of leads into Mertler and the stages that Mertler shared, but Schmuck and Runkle identified 7 steps, where right now we'd be specifying the problem, and then we're going to assess the situation and use that force field analysis, and we can talk about that in the introduction that we write to our learning environment, the setting, and what supportive forces are there to help us solve the problem and what some of the challenges might be, and those would be the restraining forces. So think about that as you write your introduction in the coming week. And then we're going to think about specifying multiple solutions and planning for action, and that's where we get into a review of the literature and what the existing research base says. We're going to anticipate obstacles, we're going to take that action and implement the project, and then we're going to collect the data and evaluate what we learned from it. So really, a lot of this is seen in Mertler talks about the planning stage, and that would be, specifying the problem and gathering info. The acting stage would be planning for action and anticipating obstacles, taking action. And then Mertler goes on to the developing stage where you're developing an action plan for the future. After you've kind of learned what you've learned, you're going to jump forward and figure out what that next step in the cycle is. And then Mertler talks about the reflecting stage. So there's just some different ways to think about action research. For this week, one of the activities that I have you doing is you're going to do an article jigsaw. So there are 4 articles that I have placed into our Moodle shell. And what I'm going to ask you to do is take a look at the article that you're assigned, and I'll give you your assignment here in just a minute. But you will complete the article jigsaw and then post your response, 3 to 4 key ideas that you found important from the article, and you're going to post that in the discussion forum. So then I would encourage you to go and take a look so that you've had kind of a glance through of all 4 articles just by viewing what people are posting in the discussion forum. We do have a small cohort, so hopefully I've got all of the articles assigned in my choice of how we're going to do this. And if not, then I will supplement. But one of the articles is written by Emily Calhoun, and it was written, I think, for Ed Leadership, which is a great publication. It's been around for years. But she wrote an article called 3 Approaches to Action Research, and she talks about individual teacher level research, collaborative action research, which we saw in Mertler, but also school-wide action research. And she'll give you some key pieces to each one of those in that article. It's a short read, but there's some value there. And I talked a little bit last week about how there are school-wide action research projects and schools that use it as a form of school improvement. So that'll give you some good ideas of how practitioners are utilizing action research in different settings across the educational landscape. So for the jigsaw, if you have a birthday in January to March, you're going to review Calhoun, which is Article 1 in the packet. If you're April to June, you're going to review Article 2 in the packet. July to September, Article 3, and October to December, there's an excerpt from an article that's just titled Action Research from National Staff Development Council. Here are the articles, oldies but goodies. They're short, to the point, and they still have pertinent information. Typically, I like to update the articles, but this was a great period of time where several large educational organizations like Education Leadership, National Staff Development Council, that have rebranded as Learning Forward, did a lot of work in this area. And the information is still very relevant today. So those are your 4 articles. Based on your birthday, you're going to read one, and you're going to post your summary into the discussion forum for week 2. Okay? So there's your main points. Just 3 to 4, just summarize, and then your reaction or your response or reflections, kind of what was the aha or the connection point, something you connected with. Okay, moving on. This week, you should be taking a look at research questions, and I've got a short activity for you to practice with. So I just want you to dig into the research questions. It is assignment 2-3 in Moodle. I'm going to pull this over so you can take a look at it here. So article jigsaw is 2-2, and then you're going to see assignment 2-3, revising action research questions. There is a PDF file that has 8 questions that are written for you. I want you to make them better. All you have to do is just open up a document, revise the questions. You don't have to put your rationale, just rewrite the questions and make them better. And I'll go over what that means in just a second. Copy paste your response right into the assignment box. You don't have to upload a document if you don't want to, just pop it in there, and then I will give you feedback next week. Okay, to revise a question, I want you to think about this. The research question should be significant and meaningful to you. It should be manageable. It shouldn't be too big or too broad. It should have some context to it. It should be clearly stated. And at times, there's some variance here. You'll see some of the writings will say you should never have an open-ended question, and others will say it should always be closed. Open-ended tends to lead to other questions, so it's okay if you want to write an open-ended question for your research question, that's fine. And then just make sure that if you do that, when you write your introduction to the project next week, that you actually clearly state what the problem is that you want to solve. So an example of something that would be significant and meaningful. What can I do to encourage quiet high school English students to participate actively in class discussions? I'm sure if you've taught high school English at times, if you want to really have a robust discussion and there are some students that are just painfully shy or something's holding them back, how do you get more engagement? In the discussion forums this last week when we were writing our Write Questions activity, I saw engagement as a theme that many people had written about in just their brainstorming. So engagement might be a question, but that would be an example of something that's manageable, it's significant, it's got context because we're talking about, where we want to focus, and it is clearly stated. Manageable. My example, this would be too broad. Why don't students do homework? And I already told you we're not doing anything with homework related, so strike that. But a better question could be, what can I do to get students to stop or to improve engagement and work outside of class? Contextual, one of the things to think about that is that should be embedded in the day-to-day work of what you're doing with students rather than an extra project added on to existing roles. So keep it contextual so that it's meaningful and it's going to actually fit into your practice. Keep it close to your own practice. Don't take something on that's bigger than what you can achieve right now, or maybe not something that's really linked to a practice. Maybe maybe it's something that you've wanted to try, but time would be a challenge for right now. So that might be a longer term goal, and I wouldn't probably advise tackling something like that for the class. So there's a couple of things just to think about. In the action research question activity, there is a handout that goes along with it, and it is examples of good AR questions. And there'll be some pieces in there for you to look at about what makes these questions good and what revisions would you suggest. And again, just review the question sheet that is in Moodle, and then turn in the 8 revised questions via the Moodle assignment area for session 2. And that's part of your participation for week 2. Let's see. For session 2, other assignments we haven't already talked about. You're going to read chapter 3 in Mertler. There's a couple of things that I will draw attention to that I think are important in chapter 3. If you take a look at page 55, at the top of 55, Mertler talks about identifying a topic for research. So chapter 3, 55, and then on page 56 and 57, he goes through and does a little bit more specific on realistic classroom problems that you could address that could be maybe linked. He talks specifically about academic problems and also classroom management. I see a lot of classroom management focused projects. I also see some that are focused on academics, like I've had elementary reading projects that are so specific on like improving learner prosody or fluency in reading. I've had mathematics problem solving, mathematics fluency. Those are just a few that have come up. So Mertler goes into some detail and provides some kind of good context for how you might further identify your problem. The other thing I wanted to point your attention to or draw your attention to is on page 71. So one of your assignments for this week that I kind of gave you a heads up to last week is I want you to get into the research database. So you can use Google Scholar, you can use ERIC, you might have access to research databases through your own school libraries, that's fine. Collins Library is a phenomenal resource. If you struggle to find anything, you're getting in the research, you get into the educational databases and you're struggling with finding anything, I want you to send me a text or an email. I will jump on a Zoom session and I will show you how to use it. I'm assuming that you've had some background. Usually by the time you get to this class, you've had an opportunity to get an orientation with the library or work with the reference librarians there through one of your other courses. If that's not the case, you contact me and let me know. For this week, your assignment that's due is you're to locate 2 research publications. So that's not something in Scholastic Magazine, that's not something on Edutopia, that is a research publication. And you are to review the publication and write a short, brief abstract. Now, if you're following APA, APA says that abstract is only 250 words. So this isn't a 2-page assignment. This should be a 1-page assignment, if 1 page. It shouldn't even be that long. So the abstract, Mertler on page 71 gives you a brief piece about what an abstract should be. And I just want you to write the abstract for the research and then do the article citation. And then I want you to post that into the discussion area for Moodle. Anything that a classmate posts in Moodle, if you see it and it's linked to a topic of interest, it's fair game. So we're essentially going to collaborate in building up some of the research that we might be able to share for projects, especially if people are thinking along the same lines for common topics. So 2 abstracts are due this week, and you're going to post the abstract in the discussion forum. Each one is worth 10 points, total of 20 points for that assignment. All right, Mertler Chapter 3, I've drawn your attention to page 71, the abstracts. So follow your APA guidelines for the assignment this week. Remember, in the syllabus, I also have the rubric, and you'll have a designation in the rubric for what an abstract should include in the final project. So that comes same criteria as for this assignment. So if you want to know what it is I'm looking for, and I'll give you a hint here in just a second. So you've got Mertler as a support for you. Mertler also talks about using the ERIC database, the Google Scholar, so there's some pointers in the text for Chapter 3. And then I also mentioned page 71, writing a literature review. This will help you in your week 3 assignment when we start to write your introduction and your research-based support for change. So Chapter 3 is actually going to get you through this week with some good references. It's also going to stair-step you into some work that we're going to do the following week. Scaffolding. I also encourage you to send me an email this week, as you should be getting closer to the topic of interest for your action research. It's okay if you don't have your question fully formulated. Email me what you're thinking. Email me your sample question, and I'll help you revise that down, or I may ask some questions back. I also will be available Tuesday night for office hours. If you want to jump into Zoom and just even say hello, hey, introduce yourself, I would love that. But I will be online. The link will be posted in Moodle from, I believe, 8 to 8:30 on Tuesday evening. So jump in, let me know what your question is, send me an email, and I'm going to use that information to start to kind of chunk people together in possible research teams for another assignment that we'll do collaboratively coming up. So that's a lot of information. Let's wrap this up. Week 2, your assignments, everything's going to be step-by-step for you in Moodle. You're reading Chapter 3 in Mertler and reviewing the resources that I provided. You're completing the article jigsaw. Read your article and post your summary and your reaction to the article in the discussion forum for the jigsaw. You're going to complete the activity of revising the 8 AR questions. So there's some resources there for you to guide you on that. And then you're completing the 2 research abstracts. The 2 research abstracts, I would advise you to, have them, use this as an opportunity to start to research what you think your action research question for your project will be, because then you're going to start to build that research database that you need to support your change, and you're going to write about that in week 3 anyway. So does it have to link? No, you can use this assignment to help rule out something that you may have thought you wanted to do, and then you got into the research and found that maybe there's not a lot to support what you thought you wanted to do. That's fine too. But I would encourage you to use this week as an opportunity to take a look at what is the existing research that's linked to your topic that you're interested in, and use the 2 abstracts as something that will help propel you forward into the next week's assignment. So hopefully that's clear. That's about 28 minutes. I'm trying to keep this short and under 30. So I'm going to sign off. Know that you can reach out to me via email, via text, or jump on Zoom on Tuesday night in office hours. Shoot me an email if you're going to plan on jumping on. Otherwise, I get lonely because I'm just hanging out by myself, or sometimes I won't log in right at 8 if I don't hear from people. So just reach out if you need me, and know that I'm here as a resource. I look forward to seeing what kind of projects we start to develop this week. So have a great week, researchers. I will talk to you soon.